Welcome back to the Project Censored Show. I am Mickey Huff with Eleanor Goldfield, and in this segment, I am joined by Eleanor Goldfield. We try to do this once a month, a segment where Eleanor and I get together and talk about current events through a critical media literacy lens. And we also have had a theme we've been revisiting this year. Is this the best we can do? That's not a rhetorical question. Eleanor and I do think that there are many amazing and capable folks living in the United States of America, or disunited states of amnesia. We certainly could be doing better in many, many ways, Eleanor. And in fact, sometimes the folks that have been in maybe a previous administration, for example, when they had the opportunity to do the best that they could, maybe they now come forward to tell us later, afterwards, that maybe they could have done something more, or maybe they knew something that they didn't say. Maybe something that if they would have done before when they were in a place of public power, maybe had some credibility remaining, that they might have been able to move the needle on really important issues, whether it's domestic or foreign policy. And in this case, Eleanor, I think you want to tell us a little bit about the curious case of Matt Miller. Is that right?
The curious case, yes. Yes, Mickey, absolutely. And I'm reminded of a recent book that actually came out by Omar El-Akkad called "One Day Everyone Will Always Have Been Against This." And basically that when it's safe, when your job isn't on the line, when the upholding of the status quo isn't on the line, then you can come out and say things the way that former spokesperson for the State Department under Biden, Matthew Miller, said recently on a Sky News podcast. Said, "I don't think it's a genocide, but I think it is without a doubt true that Israel has committed war crimes." So, and I mean, there's problems with that comment in and of itself, but the real problem here, the reason that so many people jumped on this, Mickey, is because as spokesperson for the State Department, he continuously stood up there and while smiling like a remedial Disney villain, saying,
Smirking, perhaps?
sorry,
Smirking, perhaps?
yes, smirk is a good way to put that. Basically saying that no, that there's no way of we have no proof. We have no evidence to suggest war crimes, and he said this for months, right? As he was the State Department's spokesperson, and he was basically tasked as in that role as defending. And he said in the same podcast, he said, quote, "When you're at the podium, you're not expressing your personal opinion. You're expressing the conclusions of the United States government. The United States government had not concluded that they committed war crimes, still have not concluded that," end quote. So there's this, I mean, I know that people get tired of the Nazi comparison, but let's just for fun have this comparison. If you could have heard Goebbels or whoever else saying, "Look, I was just saying what the Nazi regime thought. It wasn't my personal opinion." Would you accept that? Would you say, "Oh, that's fine then. No big deal. You were just saying what the government found"? Also, if this is the case, then where are you getting your information about war crimes from? And if you know that they're committing war crimes, how could the nation with the largest surveillance network in the world not also know that, Matthew? So it doesn't make a tidbit of sense, Mickey. It's absolute garbage. And I think what's really so disturbing to me is that either he really believes this, or he thinks that we're dumb enough to believe it. So again, is this the best that we can do?
My goodness. It's enough to maybe make younger folks cynical, turning against politics. I know that the job of press secretaries is to run interference and promote agendas, and each of the, government agencies and so on have these PR folks and so on. But if I didn't know any better, I would wonder if things haven't gotten weirder and worse in many ways. You know, speaking of curious cases, we saw serial GOP liar George Santos recently sentenced. Almost, you might have missed it in the din and the noise of the culture, right? But he actually is going to jail, to prison for more than 7 years, over this serial lying that has just become part and parcel. It's more like the air of American politics that people breathe in and out with great regularity. It seems that almost no one's capable of speaking the plain truth. Not that we're putting on antiquity lenses here, rose-colored glasses for the past, and pretending that there's this bygone glory day, when America was great. But again, let's also not pile on and say that we're teaching about how America is terrible, right? Many on the left, of course, are now being accused by this administration of teaching the youth to hate the country. And as someone that's been teaching the youth for 25 years, guilty of teaching, I've never taught anyone to hate the country. I've tried to teach people to follow the facts, to understand what truth means, teach towards our values. Our country purports to have amazing values. And these are things that we try to uphold and live up to, rather than serially denigrate. And it does cause consternation to see just such willy-nilly cavalier expressions, like coming from people like Miller, who was lying through his teeth, George Santos style. I brought up Santos for a reason. You either are to believe that these people are so dumb and incompetent that they just don't know better, or that in fact their Ivy League pedigrees have, really just kind of thrown on some sheep's clothing, just to see what they can get away with, And I think that maybe even worse than the moral crimes of prevarication, constant, fire hose of falsehoods that stem from these folks in these offices, whether it's under Biden or Trump. We'll get more to that. I think that the real crime is the installation of cynicism in younger people, that somehow we can't do better, that these are the leaders, right? And again, I just don't accept that. I don't think that that's appropriate, and I think we have obligations, as media critics, as scholars, as activists, as educators, to really set the record straight and let people know that we don't live in a post-truth world. The facts actually do matter.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like even Matt Miller might be coming around to that position.
Well, and it speaks to this. I'm reminded when I was reading the transcript of this interview that Matt Miller did. It reminded me of Nixon yelling, "Well, I'm saying when the president does it, it's not a crime." And I'm like, well, speaking of history here, almost as if that has not changed. So, Matt, when you are standing behind that podium that you spoke about, clearly it's not a crime to lie to the American people, even though you were well aware that Israel was committing war crimes, Israel was bombing hospitals, and all of these things. You were aware of that. So now that you're not behind the podium, you can tell the truth. Well, then what does that suggest about the crime of continuously lying to the American people and, of course, the world that depends on America's actions? So you're really just saying that, A, when you're behind the podium representing the United States government, it is necessary to lie, and it's also okay. But anybody else, kind of like that trope, if the cops are allowed to lie to you, but you can't lie to the cops. We have to be honest, and we have to be complacent. We have to be dutiful patriots, but you don't have to do anything to get that, to garner that respect. We're just supposed to accept it, no matter how much you lie, and no matter how much after the fact you admit that you were lying.
It's exhausting, but we definitely do not want to slip into complacency and have a normalization of this process. And it's curious, and you brought up Nixon, I am not a crook. Well, thanks to the Roberts Court, Trump can walk around and say that, and it's, well, true to a degree. Right? If it's not true, we can at least make it legal. So there's a shifting baseline of this. And again, I think that we should rightfully be skeptical spokespeople in government. You don't get to quote Ronald Reagan very often, but trust. He said trust but verify. I can't think of too many other opportunities I've had to quote Reagan outside of that one quip. It's an important one, but I mean the culture has shifted so wildly. And by the way, let's not forget, we don't want to just point out the Nixons and the Reagans and the Trumps. Let's not remember it's Ivy League attorney Bill Clinton as president that was arguing about what the definition of is.
Well, and Matt
He
Miller
was
was with the Biden administration, so
yeah. It's extraordinary, but I think that this speaks to a larger challenge in our political culture, and that is again, it's refreshing sometimes, I think, and people are caught off guard when they hear people telling the truth. But I fear that people may gradually not be able to recognize what truth actually means or facts mean. And another case in point, and then we can just take our grab bag from the recent past. Kristi Noem, a Department of Homeland Security secretary. I still have a hard time saying that without having the mind be boggled by how those words all fit together under the guise of meaning something positive for us. I mean, it's a mass surveillance apparatus, basically, working in cahoots with, well, all the agencies underneath it, and also people like Peter Thiel and Palantir. Maybe we'll get to them later. But Noam came into sharp light again recently because she didn't seem to know what habeas corpus was. So there was an exchange in a Senate hearing recently where Democratic Senator Maggie Hassan asked Homeland Security Secretary Noam if she could define habeas corpus. And you might remember that she said that it was, quote, the right that the president has to be able to remove people from this country, end quote. Eleanor,
yeah. So it's actually like the exact opposite of that.
Yeah,
The
mind-boggling moments.
I mean, and this is one of those moments where I can't believe that the people listening to this didn't just shut everything down, be like, we can't continue. This is just like somebody has to just stop. So habeas corpus is a legal principle that actually requires the government to come before a judge and provide a reason for detaining and imprisoning people. It's basically like that you can't just disappear people without a reason, right? And that so it's actually the exact opposite of the thing that she said. So this is really terrifying because if you think that something that's supposed to protect human rights is actually a tool with which to disappear people, this means that you don't just fundamentally not understand what these concepts are. You're actually using them in the opposite direction to facilitate what we've been seeing here, which is putting people in jail for, as you spoke to Lauren Harper and Seth Stern on a recent program about, disappearing people for writing an op-ed. There's not just a fundamental misunderstanding, but a 180 of these legal concepts that are supposed to be in place to ensure that people are not disappeared. So it's actually like and I have to laugh because there's so much to cry about. I can't believe that she just literally said the exact opposite. It's like, we're not even in the 2 + 2 = 5. We're in the 2 + 2 = counting is not a thing. It's like, it's just so absurd.
What are numbers?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, look, and they're invoking the Alien Enemies Act. They're going back centuries. Speaking of centuries, some people may remember, and I know this is ancient history in the United States, but some folks might remember Department of Homeland Security was created under a president named George W. Bush, son of George Herbert Walker Bush, former head of the CIA, vice president under Ronald Reagan, that really helped usher a lot of this in. And one of the things that, in addition to the Patriot Act, in addition to creating DHS, the W. Bush administration also brought in something called the Military Commissions Act. And I'm bringing that up because Andy Lee Roth, our editor at large now at Project Censored, former associate director, back in our 2008 book, our number one story was no habeas corpus for any person. The Military Commissions Act aimed to do away, and the late great reporter Bob Perry from Consortium News wrote this story, along with Tom Hartman, that looked at this and talk about going back centuries. We got to go back to 1215, Magna Carta. These people are trying to erase, and I mean, look, Kristi Noem's most recent iteration of this is maybe among the most absurd. The MCA actually tried to make arguments. Noem just basically whips out and just says, no, this is what it is. I'm going to make it up on the fly to conform to whatever it is I want it to mean. But the fact that these people are so shameless that they can do it at a Senate hearing with cameras on, with a bunch of other educated people in the room that obviously had to know what habeas corpus was or they wouldn't be there. Like you said, if this kind of nonsense would take place somewhere else, someone would stand up with a gavel and just say, I'm sorry, we've got to go to lunch. Let somebody take that person aside with a dictionary. But and here we are, making fun of it as if it's like satire.
I know.
We're jumping all the sharks here.
Again, it's so there's so much to cry about. You have to laugh. And interestingly enough, so there's a law professor at Georgetown University who recently spoke about this, and has a Substack newsletter called One First. Steve Vladeck, he's a professor of law at Georgetown University, and he talks about how there is actually a loophole, because of course there is. It's law. There is actually a suspension clause which states that the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless, kind of like the 13th Amendment, unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it. So here's the thing. Kristi Noem actually had a loophole, even though, of course, immigrants existing is not a threat or an invasion or a rebellion. But she actually had a loophole that she could have invoked, but she didn't. She just completely misunderstood what habeas corpus is. And in fact, this suspension clause has been used in the United States. It was used 4 times, as far as I'm aware. In 1861, during the Civil War. In 1871, when the Ku Klux Klan was committing mass violence in the South.
In first anti-terror laws were against the Klan.
I mean, it would make sense, one would think. In 1905, during a rebellion against the American military in the Philippines, which we have feelings about that, and in 1941, in the midst of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Now, here's the thing, though. The suspension clause, and this is where we get into, what the Trump administration is trying to do in terms of blurring the lines or even taking over other branches of government. The suspension clause can only be invoked by Congress. It cannot be invoked by the president. So regardless of what Trump has said, or regardless of whether anyone in that administration knows what these two words mean, Congress can only invoke this. Now, when I first read that, my initial reaction was, well, technically, Congress is the only one that can say we're at war. But that line has been very much blurred in the past 20 years. So it is very scary, I think, Mickey, because we see already that there has been the precedent, which also speaks to the importance of contextualizing Trump's administration and their ability to do the damage that they're doing. We see that the United States government, the executive branch, has a history of taking control of things like war, which should only be something that an act that Congress can pass, and has been placing that in the hands of a single person, i.e. the president. So it seems like there is precedent to take things like this suspension clause and just say, hey, well, now the president can be the one to say we're at war. Why can't the president also be the one to say that there's a suspension clause vis-a-vis habeas corpus against whoever we choose?
So, and there's another Miller, of course, that comes into play here. That would be Stephen Miller in the White House. That was also the one that was floating that the administration was, quote, actively looking at suspending the right to habeas corpus altogether, which, by the way, is about any person, not even citizenship. It's about any person, right? And again, just to punctuate this segment before we take a quick break, only Congress, not the president, could suspend habeas corpus. But of course, Stephen Miller's not listening to this show. Of course, Christy Noem is not listening to this show. I mean, I would have been impressed if she maybe had said something like habeas corpus was extended to the right of your pet not to be shot by its owner. But this is an administration that was warning about eating dogs and cats. So, I guess anything goes. It's not a safe time for pets in and around America anyway, I guess. Anyway, Eleanor, with that, let's segue out of this and talk about another way in which we can look at this. Is this the best we can do? What else is happening around us? Where can we find some areas of improvement? We just got done talking about how the Department of Homeland Security had no idea what habeas corpus was. We talk about previous secretaries of state's selective memory. There's certainly some other things that we can discuss. And one is our ongoing infatuation. You recently had a really great piece and sort of a great quasi rant where you were talking about our infatuation with and sometimes control by celebrity culture in the United States. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and how we've blurred lines for years, where celebrities, we're so completely in awe of or stupefied by celebrities that we've allowed in many ways to allow that culture to completely infect all sectors of our culture.
Yeah, absolutely, Mickey. So I think this has cropped up several times over the course of the past couple of years, and of course before that too. But I think a lot of people are really looking to celebrities to have a comment about what's going on in Gaza. And so a few days ago, there was some comment about, Tom York from Radiohead said something dumb about Gaza. And
yeah, again.
And my thing with that was, so what? So here's the thing. I worked in recording studios for 10 years in LA. I saw a lot of celebrities, and I can tell you that we ask too much of celebrities. Celebrities should not be the go-to for everything from what you're supposed to eat to what you're supposed to think about international affairs. They're really good at, fill in the blank, dancing, singing, acting, whatever. But this idea that celebrities should light the way for everything that we think and do is absurd. It's not fair to us, and it's not fair to them either. And here's the thing. I'm not saying that celebrities should not have political ideas. Everyone should have, and does, really. Everyone does and should have a political perspective. Now, in an ideal world, that political perspective would be based on critical media literacy and the understanding of what you're taking in and taking it in from a lot of different sources and understanding framing and things like that. That'd be in a perfect world. But I'm not saying that, because a lot of people like to say, oh, that celebrity should just shut up and sing or whatever. No, you're allowed to have an opinion.
Yeah.
It's just that this idea that they should have the same opinion as the masses is not only a ridiculous demand, it's also showing a complete lack of class analysis. The majority of celebrities are, in fact, way richer than we will ever be, right? And this is an important aspect that I feel like is missing here. Despite People magazine having a section that says, celebrities, they're just like us. They're not. Okay, they live in a world that is surrounded by wealth and surrounded, by the way, also by people who do nothing but say, oh my gosh, you're so smart, pretty much 24/7. And so this leads to an analysis that betrays their station in life. And I just think that it's really important that we not look to them to talk about the struggles of people who live off of less than $1 a day or are being ethnically cleansed or whatever the case may be, because their framing is based on their lived experiences, which are, for the most part, wildly different than ours will ever be. And I think this really speaks to also this issue that we have with American exceptionalism, that we want to be close to celebrity. We see ourselves as just one lottery ticket away from being a celebrity and being rich and famous. And that's not the reality, right? And the sooner that we recognize, as soon as we see our framing as a better representation of where we exist in the class structure, in the imperialist structure, what have you, I think we can understand that celebrities, fine, listen to them dance or sing or whatever it is, listen to their diet tips or what have you if you feel like it. But the idea that they should be the ones to light the way in terms of a class analysis or a anti-capitalist analysis, anti-colonial analysis, is absurd. And so I think we really need to detach ourselves from thinking that celebrities can be the answers to or have the answers to everything.
I'm also historically inclined to go back, and this isn't, of course, new in American culture. It's just the degree to which that it's basically subsumed most things is rather extraordinary. After all, we have had TV and movie Hollywood presidents, whether it's Reagan, the governator, right, Arnold Schwarzenegger in California, other examples. Of course, we now have, again, the reality TV president, right? And in many ways, what we see happening with Elon Musk, celebrity billionaire, with his chainsaw for bureaucracy, basically mirroring the scene in Idiocracy, where the president like rips out the AK, the automatic weapon to restore order in Congress. Just absurd. You can't really make it up. It's pretty wild, actually. I was reminded, reading this book again, The Image by Daniel Boorstin from 1961, where he really talks a lot about, under the guise of pseudo events, he has whole swaths of the book that talk about celebrity culture. And coming out of the 1950s, we're also reminded of Vance Packard and the Status Seekers. Another book in the 50s, Will Freeman's Big Name, talks about how people can capitalize on celebrity and how you can use celebrity endorsements to build your political brand. None other than John Kennedy, then Senator of Massachusetts in 1958, running for Senate. I'm sorry, he was running for Senate. This is obviously before he ran against Nixon for president 2 years later. He wrote in a then relatively obscure publication called TV Guide, right? I know I'm like going back to the boomer age, right? But I grew up reading TV Guide, right? So I knew what to be when my program was on, so I could be dutifully programmed, right? Wouldn't want to miss my propaganda sessions. Kennedy warned that TV was an amazing tool, but the warning part was he worried about what would happen if it got into the hands of someone with more demagogic tendencies, as it were. And it's interesting that Kennedy actually ended up himself using TV during the debate to kind of edge out over Nixon. And people that listened to the debate kind of seemed to side more with Nixon on the intellectual side, for better or worse. But it was undeniable, the visual element of politics. And Kennedy himself really becomes an American celebrity, as it were, right? People forget that he was not very popular at the time politically. He came from a controversial family. But the hagiographic sort of vision that we see in reverse, really kind of puts Kennedy as more of a celebrity president, right? With Marilyn Monroe and yada, yada, the whole nine, right? So I think it's really important, too, that Boorstin also reminds us that a celebrity is simply someone known for their well-knownness. And again, when we see Bono on Joe Rogan, like, there's two examples of talking to each other, right? I mean, and it's been a long time since Bono, I think sang a song for the right team. That's my personal opinion. Sorry to interject there. But, again, I think we are so addled with this. And now even I'm teaching journalism, seeing many, many young students who are interested in journalism, but they all talk about influencers. Mm-hmm. And an influencer is a career path. Yes. Content creation is now a substitute for journalism? Mm-hmm. I don't think so. I don't think all content creation is equal. Journalism is guided by a Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics. Journalism and the free press is protected by the First Amendment. I don't want to belittle influencing. I don't want to belittle content creators of the internet. That's not my purpose here. My purpose is to say that journalism is different. Mm-hmm. A free press, particularly an independent free press, would be having conversations, I think, like we're having, to really try to tell the public what's going on, to remind the public of things that maybe we've forgotten. Or as I often quip, it's difficult to forget things we're not taught. And right now, there's 47 of the 50 states with legislation or legislation pending to somehow restrict the teaching of our past to our young people. And that's from half a few years ago. Banned books. Again, we saw a little dip this last year in a slight decline of challenges to books, but that's after several years of record highs of trying to control what people see and read. There was a very disturbing court case not long ago coming out of New Orleans, dealing with the state of Texas, saying that the public does not have the right to know. In other words, it's fine for librarians to pull books if someone doesn't like them, and the public doesn't have a right to petition that for their right to know in the public space. So all of this, I guess, kind of way around to saying that celebrity culture is sort of vapidly imposed on all sort of corridors of our fading democratic republic, Eleanor. And I don't think it bodes well for us, but I also think that teaching and through education, I think that it's no accident that there's a massive attack against education from this administration. There's an attack on the press. There's an attack on legacy media, not just independent. There's an attack on nonprofits. It's clear to me that this is a very calculated anti-intellectual administration. And for all we have criticized and could say about the previous administration, they certainly did not go as far as we're seeing by a long shot in terms of what we're seeing go on right now. Eleanor, we have a few minutes left in this segment, and I know that there's at least one or two more things you wanted to bring up.
Yeah, well, and I wanna touch on the education aspect, but first, just with regards to the celebrity culture, I know that some people might counter by saying, well, look, you've got people like Roger Waters or, people who have been very outspoken, and Susan Sarandon about Gaza. And that's helpful because then people who love their music or love her movies will be engaged to look deeper. That's great. I think the important thing here is that I'm not saying that you should never look at celebrities, because I'm also not that boring of a human being. I watch movies too, okay? I listen to music, right? I just know that there's a difference between having these people be your experts on something and appreciating an art form or what have you. And I think, with Roger Waters, for instance, he'll gladly tell you, okay, well, this is where I'm getting my information. This is where and so you can then look at that, and that's great. But I think it's important that everyone cite their sources, celebrities included. And I think that we need to place less stock onto what celebrities say. Now, with regards to the education aspect, I think if you could look at history, regardless of whether we're talking about, wherever we're seeing these authoritarian regimes, they always zero in on education. And the reason is, I think this quote was attributed to Goebbels, but it could have just been anybody who was that authoritarian, that kind of lunatic authoritarian, how wonderful it is for governments that people do not think. And what you're supposed to be taught in school is to think, not what to think, but to think. And this is very dangerous for authoritarian regimes, because at some point people are going to read something where they go, wait, why does it have to be this way? And then all of a sudden you have a rebellion against an authoritarian regime. And the other point of this is that I think we have to look at the degradation historically of education in this country. And again, to your point, of course, Trump is doing something far worse than we've seen and far more coordinated and targeted. But for instance, there's people in power today that don't know things that one would argue they should have learned in kindergarten. So for instance, the head of FEMA, David Richardson, said in a meeting, a FEMA meeting, that he was unaware that the U.S. had a hurricane season. Now, I have never worked for FEMA. I have no connection, but I knew that there was a hurricane season, and this is something I learned in school like a long time ago. Another thing that David Richardson said in leaked audio from FEMA meetings was that he didn't know how big Texas was. And I quote, I'm not kidding, this is a direct quote. The other day I was chatting with my girlfriend. She's from Texas. She's got like huge red hair. I don't know why that's important to know. And I said something and she said, well, Texas is bigger than Spain. I didn't know that. So I looked at the map. Texas is huge. I mean, if you put it in the middle of Europe, it takes up most of Europe, end quote. I mean, Mickey, I wish I was reading from Mad Libs or The Onion, but this is a head of a disaster agency that doesn't know the size of Texas and also doesn't know that there's a hurricane season. Our education system has failed across the board, and now it's getting set up to fail even more.
So, Eleanor, you'll be delighted to hear that back to our talk of press secretaries and the jobs that they do. We're speaking Wednesday, June 4. This will air later. Press secretary for the Trump administration said that the FEMA head was joking. So now we're back to, oh yeah, the head of the disasters are hilarious. Why not crack more jokes about them as we approach what have been deadlier and deadlier hurricane seasons? Again, this phrase is overused in this segment, but it does boggle the mind. How this kind of again, is it incompetence rising to the top? Pete Hegseth, etc. Are we really in this much of an intellectual deficit at the upper rungs of government? Or is this again sort of a ruse, a bad joke being played out on everyone?
An awkward gesture.
Yeah. So again, we're back to cynicism and skepticism. I will remain skeptical, but I refuse to become cynical because I don't think this is the best we can do. And I think by calling it out and sometime infusing a little bit of dark humor is how we get through the day. But I think it's important to note that these kinds of situations are happening across our government. They shouldn't be tolerated, and they surely shouldn't be normalized, Eleanor. So anyway, we are here at the end of another segment of Is This the Best We Can Do on the Project Censored Show? Eleanor, any parting words for our audience today?
No, I think that's about it, Mickey. And I appreciate you reminding folks and reminding me that this should never be normalized. And while we can joke about this, this really represents a serious issue, and we have to remain vigilant in calling this out and doing better, because as you pointed out at the beginning of this segment, there are so many brilliant people in this country, so many people who know how to address these problems, who have the answers. That's who we need to go to.
Absolutely. And with that, I'm Mickey Huff with Eleanor Goldfield. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Project Censored Show. We'll see you next time.